Greetings and welcome back to room 303, and we now turn in our series of conversations about the Harvard Classics back to volume 1, and the second of our writers will be working with John Woolman is his name, W-O-O-L-M-A-N. His date 1720 to 1772. What's fascinating about the selection of Woolman as the second in this series of the Harvard Classics volume number 1, Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, known around the world. We just finished that conversation together. John Woolman, most people today don't know of at all. And they certainly don't know about his journals, which is going to be what we will be taking a look at. Now, why this obscure text as a second text? I think there's a number of reasons, and we'll discover it right away. Woolman was a fighter. He was a hero because he was a fighter. He showed tremendous moral courage because he was one of the first great voices of the abolitionist movement. Write that down. That's going to be an important thing for us to say, is that John Woolman, when we hear his name, we want to think about the abolitionist movement before there was an abolitionist movement in America and in the colonies. It says a lot about our creators of the Harvard Classics, Dr. Eliot, that he would include so early in his series an individual like John Woolman. We want to use these texts to grow ourselves. We've already said this before. We come back to it again. To improve, evolve. I'm going to come back to this term here in a bit as we talk about the evolution of moral development, because we have to ask the question about slavery in the American experience. I've already said to you in earlier conversations what I will say again, that you're not born a patriot. You choose to be a patriot, and if you haven't made that choice, there's a good argument to be made that it is not your fault, but rather the older generation's fault for not providing you reasons, good enough reasons, to actually consider yourself a patriot or worthy of patriotism, or the willingness to look at your country with eyes of honor, as I have often said it together with you in 303. Of course, one of the problems is that to be a true patriot, you have to be able to see, accept, not just the great things about your country, but the evils, the really black blemishes, the bad stuff. And of course, you cannot speak about the American experience and experiment without speaking about slavery. Very quickly, who is John Woolman? Obviously, as we've said before, you can do your online research to find out more about this guy, although you're going to be stunned to find out we don't know a lot about him. Really, we only know about him through his journal itself. He dies, though. This is significant. I've already said it, but let's go back to it. The date you already wrote down. Remember, born in 1720, dies in 1772. You can kind of see how young he was when he dies in England on a mission trip there. He was a Quaker. He dies in 1772. His journals are published in 1774. Think about that date as you write it down. Jefferson and his pals will write, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are, we know it, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness." All of that happening in 1776. So think about your dates here. That will place Woolman and his text in its appropriate historic context. He is a devoutly religious Quaker. And he's the great abolitionist voice. In fact, he's been called one of the great uncanonized saints of America. I like that line because it speaks directly to his influence, Woolman's influence, even though his name is rarely mentioned in circles when we are talking about the history of the abolitionist movement. We're going to point out that it took tremendous courage for a woman to do the things that he did. We're going to talk about that as we get into our study here. Let's pause for a moment now, though, and let's just ask this, because we are students of the American history. We have to ask this question. Slavery, how can you explain it? Let's phrase the question in a couple of different ways. And if you've not engaged this question, it probably is time that you engage this question. Why is it that you have to understand the institution, as is often called by historians, of slavery to understand America? And it is absolutely vital that you do so. We can, of course, immediately go back to our study of Aristotle, his view about the organic or the natural declension of males, females, slaves, beasts of burden, and the like. His argument was that it is the will of the gods, it is natural that some men and women are born to be slaves. That's the way that it is. And of course, that idea, which is really fundamentally an ontological idea, ontology ever relating to the study of being, that ontological argument carries weight for a very long time. I mean, Aristotle, of course, living roughly 400 years before birth of Christ. You can see the dates that we're talking about with Woolman. So you can see an idea that lasts 2,000 years is an idea that for most people makes common sense. Even though after the fact we look at it and ask, how could it be possible that devout Christians, and we are going to meet these devout Christians in our study of Woolman's journal, would practice and support the selling of human beings in the slave markets? How is that even possible? For us to wrap our brain around that, we obviously are going to have any number of text sources that we're going to want to reference. Obviously coming to mind, and we'll meet it later at 3a, is that famous letter that Martin Luther King Jr. wrote from Birmingham Jail. Remember, he's in jail because he is a disruptor of the society there. And of course, his letter is written to who? To white ministers, Christian ministers, who have claimed about MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., that what he's doing is morally wrong. It's upsetting society. Of course, we studied together, and I've already given a lecture on the Birmingham Jail letter because it's such an important moment in thought. But of course, let's pay attention to our timing. 100 years after Woolman's life, we fight the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. 100 years later is Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. 200 years after Woolman's journals, still the fight over understanding all humans as created equal. Amazing. Of course, there's always the question of the religious connection to slavery. Isn't it true that the Bible says slavery is wrong? Isn't it true that the Bible says that slavery is acceptable? The Bible was put in our notes. The Bible can be read in certain ambiguous ways regarding both positions. For example, we will even hear often about the quote-unquote mark of Cain as being the explanation as to why certain people of a skin color will be considered victims of slavery, and it's okay. We'll hear Woolman, in fact, respond to this in his journals. Can we explain why slavery, though? Let's go ahead and see if we can. First of all, and we've spoken about this before, but let's put it in our notes again, from an epistemological position, epistis, of relating to knowledge, we have kind of a three-tangent view, three-part view. On the one hand, epistemologically speaking, we have the absolutist position. I'll not put this on the whiteboard because we've done it before already. I'll just call it to mind. On the one hand, the absolutist position, I am right, you are wrong. Of course, we understand a position like this can be sometimes dangerous because people will fly airplanes into buildings and kill lots of people over a position that's absolutist like this. It's complete polar opposite, right? It's antithesis, to speak in Hegelian terms. If the absolutist position is the thesis, the antithesis, its opposite for Hegel, the great German philosopher, is the position of the relativist. That is to say, there are no absolutes. Of course, if I were to write that term, there are no absolutes, on the whiteboard, any one of you could point out you've just written what appears to be an absolute. To say there are no absolutes is itself an absolute. And therefore, we have engaged in what we will call, as we've said before, the performative contradiction. In the process of saying there are no truths, I am uttering a truth. Because the performative contradiction annuls the relativist, extreme relativist position, many people come back to the absolutist position, epistemologically speaking, because they don't know where else to go. But in the history of thought, there is a third position. We call it the fallibilist position. Of course, we know it as the scientific position from the Enlightenment on, and it says the following. I hold a position, epistemologically. I think it's right, I could be wrong. I'm going to act on this position as right until somebody shows me otherwise. We can now simply say it. The slavery issue is in large measure, epistemologically, going to be a position held by absolutists. They do not want to hear any kinds of questions about the slavery position and the slavery question as it was often raised. And we'll find that, in fact, Woolman does that. We can also explain slavery not only from the epistemological position, but also from the ontological position. I've already used this term. Of course, we know it well. Ontology of or related to the study of being and value. We can speak ontologically about moral development, and we can point out, and we've again seen this paradigm, but we'll go ahead and outline it quickly one more time. We can argue that, in fact, human beings evolve, I told you we'd come back to that term, evolve morally from an egocentric position. Everything is about me, 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 and only me. Of course, all 3-year-olds are like this, which is why we have to have parents that say, no, you don't get to act like that. No, you don't get to think that the world is just about you. And we proceed or progress or evolve, morally speaking, from an egocentric moral position, all that matters is my own moral stance, to an ethnocentric position. In other words, we are taught within our family, within our tribe, within our state, within our group, whatever that group is, it could be a religion or whatever, certain kinds of truths. And because other people hold these truths, I hold these truths, the ethnocentric position. Of course, the challenge of the ethnocentric position is, I hold a certain view, but I have to accept that other people have a different view because they were born differently from me. So, for example, I might hold a profound position in regards to my own religious persuasion, but I have to ask, if I was born on the other side of the planet and I was raised in a different kind of religious culture, wouldn't I hold the same position? Or I remember the students who got into a fight at Whirlwind High School, verbal, because one of them was our exchange student from France. My American student couldn't understand how she did not realize America is the greatest country in the world. She couldn't understand that. And I heard them debating rather heatedly. My French foreign exchange student kept saying to her, no, the best country in the world is not America, it's France. You wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for the French. Of course, historically speaking, she had some legs to stand on, yes? Of course, my student pointed out, well, what about the Second World War and the fact that the Americans had to come over and save your camp? You can see how this is beginning to devolve. My observation is that from an ethnocentric position, of course we feel our country best, our religion best, our ideas as a group best. That, of course, is a step forward from the egocentric moral position, but obviously it creates some potential problems when our position is the only position. Of course, and we're going to see this with John Woolman, there is another step in our moral development. We will call this a world-centric view. It says that you can hold a position that's ethnocentric, but at the same time you begin to appreciate there are other kinds of positions in the world that are held, other understandings, other religious views, other political views. And there needs to be some understanding of a respect or an inclusivity of those views as well. Still holding on to your own views. In other words, you can be a patriot to your country and respect the fact that people who live in other countries have the same kind of passion and respect. We're familiar when we watch, for example, the Olympics and other national anthems are played, that of course those athletes who represent Brazil or represent Germany or represent China, they begin to cry and weep with as much passion. Why? Because of course they are every bit the patriot as we are, even though of course for a different country. Finally, the American philosopher Ken Wilber and other integralists have pointed out that there is actually a fourth position, the integralist position, which takes into account all three prior positions as necessary through the individual's spiritual moral evolution. Well, we can now use this model and define the whole institution of slavery through the air, quite frankly, that both whites and blacks breathed. In other words, it's the way it is, to quote, of course, teleology. And because that's the case, it was accepted cultural wisdom, religious wisdom, dare we say it, ethnocentric wisdom. It could only be changed or reformed when someone, let's call it John Woolman, for example, has the courage to say, I don't think so. I just want to point out for your notes, and we'll come back to this idea. Imagine the courage that it takes to live within a given cultural milieu and to say to the tribe, to the group that has provided you with everything you have, I think we're wrong on this count. Whoa. Because obviously the moment you do that, you are going to have certain kinds of attacks. Let's turn now to the text itself. And let's begin to pay attention to just a few of the lines that are going to maybe resonate, certainly resonate for me as someone who has read this and wants to share it with you. Opening lines of the Journal of John Woolman. I have often felt a motion of love to leave some hints in writing of my experience of the goodness of God. Again, a devout Quaker. And now, in the 36th year of my age, I begin this work. And then he begins to kind of tell about himself and his life and some of the things that are of greatest interest for him. I'm going to move on into the journals and just begin to pick out some of what are my favorite passages here. For example, he will make some observations about religion. He says, I kept steadily to meetings, spent first day afternoons chiefly in reading the scriptures and other good books, and was early convinced in my mind that true religion consisted in an inward life wherein the heart does love and reverence God the Creator and learns to exercise true justice and goodness, not only toward all men, but also toward the brute creatures. That is, as the mind was moved by an inward principle to love God as an invisible, incomprehensible being, so by the same principle it was moved to love Him in all His manifestations in the visible world. And of course, that's the first step towards, as we read it in the Bhagavad Gita, the great Hindu text, to recognize or to see all being in ourself and ourself in all being. It's at that moment that woman, of course, will look at a slave on the podium in a slave market and it will ask, is he not a human? Is he not a child of God, as he understands his understanding of children of God, and therefore deserving of respect, acceptance, and love? I'll keep going. Another passage that I find quite remarkable. The moment that he knew, we'll ask about this at level 3B, a personal relationship. The moment you figure something out, the moment you know. Of course, we'll call this later when we study James Joyce an epiphany. He says it this way. My employer, having a Negro woman, of course this will be the language that's used in the time that he's writing, sold her and desired me to write a bill of sale, the man being wanting who bought her. The thing was sudden. And though I felt uneasy at the thoughts of writing an instrument of slavery for one of my fellow creatures, yet I remember that I was hired by that year, and it was my master who directed me to do it, and that it was an elderly man, a member of our society, in other words, part of my church, who bought her. So through weakness, it's an important parenthetic, through weakness I gave way and wrote it. But at the executing of it, I was so afflicted in my mind that I said before my master and the friend that I believed slave keeping to be a practice inconsistent with the Christian religion. This in some degree abated my uneasiness, yet as often as I reflected seriously upon it, I thought I should have been clearer if I had desired to be excused from it as a thing against my conscience, for such it was. We will see this throughout the journals, that John Woolman begins to wake up. His conscience begins to wake up. And he begins to realize there is something fundamentally wrong with the idea that humans can sell and buy other humans, especially if one considers oneself to be religious. I'll jump over a little bit later now into the journals. Again, obviously I recommend that you find these and read them all on your own. Let's take a look at this notion that the Bible validates the idea of slavery. As he will write here, I further reminded Christians, men and women of his congregation, how the prophets repeatedly declare that the Son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the Father, but everyone be answerable for his own sins. This idea that the reason why slaves are slaves is because Cain did something long ago and bears the mark of Cain and all of that. He says, I was troubled to perceive the darkness of their imaginations, and in some pressure of spirit said, now quoting, the love of ease and gain, here we'll think of Marx, won't we, and the whole economics theory, are the motives in general for keeping slaves, and men are wont to take hold of weak arguments to support a cause which is unreasonable. I have no interest on either side, save only the interest which I desire to have in the truth. I believe liberty is their right, and as I see they are not only deprived of it, but treated in other respects with inhumanity in many places, I believe he who is a refuge for the oppressed will, in his own time, plead their cause, and happy will it be for such as walk in uprightness before him. And thus, our conversation ended. In other words, he points out, he would meet people who were engaged in transactions with slaves and slavery. And he would point out to them, you have no religious grounding for this action, even though you think you might, because what you want is someone to do work that you don't want to do. Of course, that work needs to be done so that you can make what? Yes, right, money. And he will point out there's something fundamentally unchristian about this. Of course, we will say unhuman, inhuman about this as well. I'll continue his ideas to